How do you produce amazing records? Well, it turns out there's about 1 million hours of YouTube tutorials you can watch to figure it out. Or you could stay tuned and watch this video where I condense over 500 hours of watching music production tutorials into about 20 minutes. I'll break down all of the biggest pieces of advice I've learned and give you some actionable steps to help take your tracks to the next level. Let's do it. Let's get one thing straight. I've watched a ton of music production videos, like too many, like every night for 3 years, and they've taught me a ton about making music. Since I've started this journey over 10 years ago, I was able to quit my job. I now run a full-time music studio. I've written a full book about music production. Thank you to the 20 people that have downloaded it. And I've managed to get way better at the actual art of music production. So when I say 500 hours of music production tutorials that I've watched, it's probably more. Just know that the pieces of advice that I'll give will be the most important. And they'll also work for any DAW, so don't worry about that. And also, for those that are serious about improving, I've got a free 30-day music production challenge sheet, calendar, outline, guide, action plan that you can download for free from my website. It'll lay out exactly what you need to do to get your next songs finished and completed. And isn't finishing songs really what we're all just trying to do here? And with that preface out of the way, let's get started with the 21 best pieces of advice I've learned from over 500 hours of music production tutorials. Tip 1, sounds matter. A lot. If you didn't know, the sounds you use are one of the biggest determining factors of your end sound. It sounds simple, but the amount of time I've wasted because I didn't know this or understand it is a lot. I used to think that I could change a sound with processing like EQ and reverb and distortion, and yes, you can, but if your bass sounds like a wet fart, no amount of processing is going to fix that. Use good samples, good recordings, use good software instruments, and if you're not sure if they're good in the first place, just trust your ears. The amount of tracks I get sent now that use some bad stuck piano plugin is just too damn high. If you want professional sounding tracks, you have to use better sounds. Don't expect to fix bad sounds later. Tip number 2, bus your reverb. Some call this an aux track, some call this bussing, but I call it essential. Bussing your reverb means you create a separate track for just your reverb. Then you send your normal tracks to this track to get the reverb sound. But Maddie, why do you have to do this? Well, 3 reasons. Speed, processing efficiency, and audio connectedness. If I've got a bus with a reverb on it, all I have to do is send my track to that bus and I've got reverb. Bada bang. This technique also saves a bunch in computing power. Instead of your track having 20 reverb, you just have the ones on your reverb buses. And lastly, using all of the same reverb for your instruments will put them together in a shared reverby space, which will help them blend together and sound magical. To make a bus in Logic, I use Logic, but it's very similar in other DAWs. Just click this empty space here on your track where it says sends. Go to bus, choose an empty bus, and there you go. Add your reverb to the new track. Make sure the wet is at 100%, and now this knob here will be your send. The higher it is, the more reverb will be added. And moving right along into tip number 3, which is sidechaining is super cool. Sidechaining is a bit more advanced of an audio production topic, but once you get it down, it's gonna make your mixing a whole hell of a lot easier. For those that don't know, sidechaining is when one sound gets quieter automatically whenever another sound plays. It's like when the music will lower in volume every time someone sings. You can sidechain any 2 elements together, and you can sidechain any part of the frequency spectrum. The most common items to sidechain are your kick and your bass. They both take up a whole lot of low end, and they often compete for space down there, right? Wrong. Well, not wrong, but they don't have to compete as much with sidechaining. You can tell your plugin that every time this kick plays, compress the bass by this amount. And then there's even plugins that will let you only affect a certain part of the frequency spectrum, like FabFilter's Pro Multiband Compressor. We can do the same thing as before, but now we're lowering the volume of the low frequencies only. This makes mixing so much easier. I'll use this for multiple guitars, vocals, reverbs, bass, and kicks. If you can name it, chances are it can be sidechained. Tip number 4, keep it simple, stupid. Kiss isn't just an 80s glam rock band with a bunch of makeup. It's also a helpful acronym for making music. Keep it simple, stupid. As music producers, it's really easy to add way too many sounds to tracks. When I first started making songs, I'd add a pad, a brass section, a string section, a synth solo, a guitar riff, and all that it amounted to was a cluttered mess of audio garbage. Add things with purpose and try to keep your songs as simple as you can. If you strip away your song's parts, is it still good? If it isn't, all you're doing is putting glitter on a piece of shit. Go back to the drawing board and write another song. But if it is a gold nugget, adding too many elements can take away its shine. So stop overproducing your song, stop adding 4 melodies at a time, stop playing the most complex bass line when your vocal is the main focal point. Keep it simple, stupid. Tip number 5, organize your tracks in songs. I am very guilty of this today, but naming a song Cool Beat 3 isn't helpful at all. If I had a nickel every time I've clicked and opened through all my music files and hard drives looking for one specific song, I probably could have retired 5 years ago. Be descriptive with your project names. Put the key, put the style, put the BPM, put the client's name, damn it. This is kind of turning into a rant for myself. But don't let your best songs get lost because you couldn't spend 30 seconds descriptively naming your song. A bad name would be Dopest New Beat Final. A good name would be Travis Scott type beat, 135 BPM, E minor, August 2024. You see what I mean? Also, as a little bonus tip, if you make a bunch of different mixes of your song, save each one. In front of each beat name, you can add mix 1, mix 2, master 1, master 2, depending on what stage you're in. You'll always be able to come back and compare these versions later. Also, don't name things final. It's like a curse. If you name a track Final, there is a 100% chance you're going to go back and change something. A better way of naming tracks is with version numbers like you would with software. Version 1.0, version 1.1, version 3.0. Trust me on this one, this has saved me a bunch of time. Organizing songs also goes hand in hand with organizing the tracks themselves. As tempting as it is to leave all of your audio recordings unnamed, yes, I do this a lot. It's going to confuse the hell out of you when you try to reopen your project even next week. Come up with a color convention and naming convention so that you know what tracks you're working on at a glance. The less brain power you have memorizing what track number 34 is, the more you can focus on actually making music. I use the following colors to color my tracks when I get serious about mixing and releasing a song to help me do just that. For red, I use drums. For orange, I use bass. Blue, guitars and strings. Green, synths and keys. Purple, vocals, and then pink, FX. This lets me pull up any project, instantly recognize the sound, and then get my fingers mixing right away. Steal it if you want to. And after that nice half tip, let's move on to tip number 6, which is music theory is your friend. Although music theory isn't the popular kid at the school dance, without him there, well, there wouldn't be a dance at all. Whether you realize it or not, music theory connects the dots on why certain music sounds go well together. And the more you understand it, the easier music making becomes. And no, you don't need to learn music theory, but you absolutely should. Music theory helps answer hard questions like what melody should I use or what chord progression should come next. It's not one of the most glamorous of topics, but if you want to produce awesome music, it is very helpful to know. I made an introduction to music theory you can watch and learn more about right up here. Moving right along to tip number 7, which is layer your sounds. All that layering your sounds means is adding multiple instruments to play the same part or sound. This lets you add depth by combining sounds from different instruments. Say you want to make a brand new sounding bass line and combine the low end of one bass that you like with the high end of another bass. That is totally doable. Just create 2 different tracks and layer them on top of each other. Notice how I combined these 2 basses in the song to give it a new sound. Here's the original bass, and here's it combined. Gives it a little bit more space and a little bit more interesting depth. I can also use EQ to further combine these. Let's say I only like the low end of one of the basses. I can cut out the low end of the other bass and let them sit together even better. Using EQ to help these layers sit better together is usually a good choice to use, and it can help your layers stand out even more. Moving on to the next tip, which is a little distortion goes a long way. Many times when we're recording, we get an overabundance of low, mid frequency information. To help combat that, we can add some subtle distortion to add some harmonics to our otherwise kind of mid-low range sound. A little bit of overdrive can go a long way to adding in some harmonics. Right now we can see our 200 to 500 is probably the most highest energy frequency spectrum of this guitar. But if we add some subtle overdrive beforehand, we can increase that ever so slightly, and it won't sound all that different. Take the tone up here. You can see the more overdrive I add to this, the smaller that these bridges are getting up here and the more high-end harmonic information I'm adding. Normally adding this very subtly will make your song sound a lot better. And it's something I do on a ton of different tracks just to give it a little bit more analog feel, but also just to fill out the frequency spectrum even more. Moving on to the next tip, which is live instruments are better than virtual instruments. Yes, I said it. Live instruments are always going to sound more energetic, have more life, and have more passion than their software counterparts. I get it, it's not always feasible to record a live acoustic piano, and it's hard to keep it in tune, and you got to do all this other jazz, but I'm telling you, if you can do it, it's going to pay dividends. Although software instruments are sounding more and more realistic by the year, there's something that's inevitably human about a person playing a real life instrument. Recording real life instruments with real microphones includes the natural room acoustics. It's just a different level of harmonic information that you get from those microphones. You can do some things to recreate this if you're using MIDI, which is so much more common. But live instruments give that human feel for a few reasons. Normally, humans don't play everything perfectly on the grid. And on the grid just refers to directly on these grid lines that you see here. Oftentimes with MIDI, and you can see with this drummer here, they're directly on the grid, perfectly quantized to the beat. Live instruments and live musicians are often a slightly bit off of that. So you can actually go into your MIDI or whatever you want to do and change that by selecting all, and you can either nudge them or even just move them slightly off the beat. But you can hear what happens. The beat's gonna be way more laid back with this farther back. Just depends on the vibe that you're going for. Another thing that I find especially better with live instruments is hi-hats specifically. Drums are very hard to record properly, but hi-hats, especially live human-played hi-hats, are miles better than any software equivalent. I know that live instruments can be a whole different ballgame in terms of recording. You have to learn how to record them, have the microphones to do so, have the actual skill to play the instrument or hire someone to do that. So it's not as common as you might think, but all of the best records are doing it. All of the top studios are hiring session instrumentalists, hiring people that will play the drums, etc., to get the best sound they can. So just keep that in mind. That leads me on to my next tip, which is plan out your arrangement. Your arrangement is just the way that your song flows from part to part. Whether it starts with the verse, then goes to the chorus, then goes to the second verse, then the bridge, etc. That is all I'm talking about when I mean your song arrangement. And a big problem I hear with amateur music I get sent is a complete lack of arrangement. It's one thing to know the rules of song arrangement and then break them, but it's another thing completely to just throw them out the window. The reason song arrangement is so important is because it helps play with the emotions of your listener. Normally, when starting off, a verse might be a little bit more intimate and a little bit quieter with a little bit less energy than, say, the other parts of the song. That means when you actually get to the most energetic part of the song, the chorus or your hook, you are ready to explode the listener's brain with all of this energy, all of these other parts coming in. It's like you're taking a person on an emotional journey of a roller coaster. And if you don't think about structuring your song like that, verse, chorus, and what's going to be the emotional highs and the emotional lows, your song's going to be impacted for the worse. If you plan out your arrangement before or as you're working on the song and what parts are going to have what amount of energy, it's really going to help you out. Moving on to the next tip, which is automation equals life. And I say that for two reasons. Automation equals life because automation will give life to your tracks. But also, automation is life. If you're not doing automation, you're probably not producing as high quality music as you can. If you're not sure about automation, all it is using different parameters and making them change or move over time. The most common automation is probably volume. If you click A on your keyboard in Logic, it will pull up the automation window and you can start clicking and dragging dots. And just like you might expect, when you drag the dots down, the volume gets lower, and when you drag it higher, it gets higher. So this line will start at negative 28 decibels and over time we'll get to -1. You can hear it getting louder and louder. Now, although the most common thing to automate is probably volume, I would never recommend actually automating the volume on the track. A better trick is to go after all of your plugins here, click on Utility, go to Gain, and then automate this Gain plugin. This will allow you to move the fader after the fact, which will be super helpful. Let's delete this by highlighting it, clicking Delete, and then we'll go into Gain right here, use Gain. We're essentially doing the same thing, but this will allow us to use our fader. If we don't do this, we won't be able to move our fader later. So now this is too quiet to hear, but we can automate it higher. You can hear it getting louder, nice. And so we automated our gain on our plugin instead of automating our volume directly. If we automate our volume directly like we did before, you'll see our fader literally moving, and that will mean we won't be able to change the fader later, which is why I prefer to automate gain. Not as ideal. One of my favorite things to automate for songs is called a low pass filter, and that means that as the song goes, I want to automate this to go higher and higher. So I'll just play this for you and automate it manually with my mouse. You can hear it really opens up and just adds and builds more energy. Especially for EDM, I use this all the time. And an easy way to automate that is actually to go into your track itself, click A on the automation tab, then change your automation mode to latch. Latch will identify any parameter that you move in time when the song is playing and automatically create an automation track for it. So we can do that same thing we just did, and check it out. You see that line moving there? That means it's selected it. And we can manually add that in. Now, let's say we weren't exactly happy with that. We can just take this, delete some of the ones in the middle, and we have a little bit more clean of a line here. And we can adjust it as need be, as we want. After you've recorded your automation with Latch, go back to read. Otherwise, any changes that you make as you're listening to your song will get recorded with automation. But I promise the more that you can use automation and get used to automating certain parameters, the more interesting that you can make your songs. It's so easy to automate reverb or delay, especially once you use that Latch trick. Your tracks are going to benefit from it. On to the next tip, which is drop out the low end. This kind of goes with my song arrangement philosophy, but if you drop out your low end and have no low end, when you finally do bring back your low end to your song, it's going to hit so much harder, I promise. Although this song is still really in its basic stages and not really mixed that well, you can hear just from an arrangement standpoint, when we go into this pre-chorus, we drop out the bass completely, and then once we go into the chorus, we add it back in, and it just makes it seem way more impactful. It's the lack of bass that makes the actual bass when it hits way bigger. Try it in your own song. On to my next tip, which is carve out space for each instrument. I know these tips are very aptly named, and this one has to do with EQ. When I say carve out space, I'm specifically talking about the frequency spectrum of each instrument. If you look at a frequency analyzer, like clicking on EQ or whatever, you can see that there's harmonic information that's happening there. Each set of instruments or instruments you use will generally sound the best or take up certain frequency slots. And if you think of them as kind of slotting a puzzle together, it will make your EQ moves make a lot more sense. It will make your song arrangement and the chords you use also make a lot more sense. And it will just make your whole track sound better. To better explain this, I've actually made a drawing that I'm going to show you now. As you are going through and kind of slotting each piece in with EQ, there's another tip that you'll need to know that will help you along the way, which is tip number 14, stop soloing. The only reason you should solo is to hear what one instrument's doing. If you're going through and kind of editing the audio and you hear like a blip or click, you can solo, that's fine. But if you're mixing, nobody listens to a song track soloed. It just doesn't happen. There's more than one instrument happening at a time, people, so don't mix in solo. It's an easy trap to fall into. Just because something sounds good in solo doesn't mean it's going to sound good with the rest of the mix. So why not save yourself the hassle and just mix everything together by listening to everything at the same time? Just trust me, take my word for it. On to tip number 15, which is parallel compression sounds more natural. Parallel compression is when you take a sound and duplicate it onto a new track, with the new track having a very compressed setting and the old track having a non-compressed setting. Then you can mix the two to taste to get the benefits of both a compressed sound, but also still the life and energy of the original sound. This is also called New York compression. So here I've just duplicated my guitar onto a Audio 10 track. We're going into compressor here. You can see it's super compressed, but if we go into this one doesn't have any compression. And now we can blend the two together to get the best of both worlds. We'll still get the dynamic kind of energy of the original recording, but now we can just mix into taste how much compression sound we actually want to hear without taking away too much life from the original sound. So now we're at a happy medium. So this is how you used to be able to do parallel compression, but there's actually an easier way to do it nowadays with almost every compression plugin that I've seen. If you open a compression plugin, which by the way, in Logic, you can click on this bar here and it will open it up for you. You can just compress like you normally would. find the settings you like, maybe even overdo it a little bit, and then take the mix knob here and bring it down. You're essentially doing the same thing as before. You're gonna get more natural sounding results, and you can turn the mix knob up to taste depending on what you want to do. If you're looking for some more ways to get natural sounding compression, it leads into my next tip to chain compressors together for that more natural sound. Compression will reduce the dynamic range of any set of audio waveform. As you can see in this audio waveform here, we have some peaks that are a little bit lower, like this peak is lower than this peak here in volume. And so if we were to play this, you can hear that this note right here is louder than this set of notes here. That is typically why you might throw a compressor on. A compressor will help to smooth out all of those kinks and those sounds to make them more compressed or more similar in volume. However, if you overcompress something, a lot of the life of that original recording is going to be lost. A lot of that original recording comes from those discrepancies in volume and those dynamics. So you want to keep those in. But sometimes you do want that volume in case you can't hear a certain note. So instead of using one compressor with a high ratio, I recommend using multiple chain compressors in a row. To duplicate a plugin like that, you can just hold Option on your keyboard, click and drag and let go, and bada bang, we have 3 compressors all with the exact same settings. I'll normally just chain 2 together and then adjust as need be. I'm looking for something but below -10 dBs of gain reduction. This is what this graph represents here. And if I have that on both of those, I know I'm going to have a compressed signal that's going to sound a little bit more natural and a little bit cleaner than just using heavy compression on one compressor. And on to my next tip, don't clip. There is a lot of advice about gain staging out there, but the biggest thing that you need to know is just don't clip. If you clip on your recording and say your input looks like this, the chops of your audio waveform are going to get cut off, and there's nothing that you can do to fix that after the fact. So you have to re-record. There's nothing that you can do to fix it. If you're clipping into your stereo outputs, just take all your tracks, turn them down. Ideally, I like to shoot for around -8 dBFS on this stereo out meter right here. I'm at -7.4, so that's about good. This will leave you plenty of space so that when you actually master your track, you'll have enough headroom so that you don't run into any of these clipping problems that I just mentioned. Which goes into the next tip, which is to master your tracks at least to -14 LUFS. I used to think that -14 was enough, but nowadays I know it's not. I know the error of my ways. Don't follow what I used to do. Please. For mastering, the biggest thing that you're doing is really just bringing up the song's volume to be competitive with other songs. You're bringing up the loudness of the song as well as some of the compression so that you can actually compete with some of the loudness of other songs. When we measure that loudness, we use an acronym called LUFS, which stands for Loudness Units Full Scale, and is another kind of more accurate way of measuring volume. Almost every streaming platform out there will normalize your track to -14 LUFS. That means any track that gets submitted to, say, YouTube or Spotify that's higher or louder than -14 LUFS, say -10 LUFS, they will automatically turn down using their algorithm. This is good because that saves you from having to reach for the volume knob every single video when everybody's uploading different volumes of audio. So that's why I used to think that -14 LUFS was what I should shoot for. Any more compressed than that, and I'm starting to take away from the life of my track that I talked about a little bit earlier. But now I know that for certain genres, you'll want to compress your sound even more to be competitive. There are some settings that you can change on Spotify that will let you listen to the original audio of a track and what it was actually mastered at. And if somebody has that turned on and your song's only at -14 LUFS, it's going to seem significantly quieter than another song. And one of the biggest tricks that you'll hear in audio engineering is if a song is louder or if a track is louder, it's going to sound better. It's just a natural tendency of the ear. Louder equals better sounding. So if your track sounds quieter, it's not going to sound as good. That's why for some certain genres like EDM, pop, or hip hop, -14 LUFS is just not enough. Master your tracks to say -10, -9 LUFS, and you'll have a much more competitive end sound. When you're mastering your tracks, I recommend using a meter. My favorite meter that I use is called the Ulean Loudness Meter, and it happens to be free. So what I'll do is I'll put it on my stereo out track. I'll see where my LUFS is coming in. Right now I have -22. Before my meter, I'll put a limiter. A limiter will help me get it to the actual LUFS it needs. My favorite is called the Pro L2. I'll up my gain. And now you can see my LUFS has all of a sudden gone way up. I'll adjust these settings as need be, but this is kind of the basics I'll use for mastering. Remember, the higher LUFS you go, the more compressed your sound will be and the less kind of natural dynamics and transients it'll have. Those dynamics are the difference between the loudest and the softest sounds. I actually have a full video on mastering using Logic stock plugins that you can check out right up here. On to my next tip, which is the rules don't matter if it sounds good. If you're just trusting your ears and you're not exactly sure about a lot of these tips I've said, it doesn't really matter if it sounds good to you. At the end of the day, music making is about making cool sounds and things that sound good together. And if I am telling you to sidechain something and it doesn't sound as good sidechained, then just don't do it. Use your ears, trust your ears. If it sounds good, it is good. Moving on to my next tip, which is probably one of the biggest things that you can use to get good at music production fast, is to use reference tracks. Reference tracks are finding songs in your genre and using them as a guide to help guide your mixing process, to help guide your song arrangement, to help guide the sound selections that you actually choose for your song. I'd recommend choosing between 3 and 5 songs that you really vibe with that are all in the same genre of music that you want to make. Listen to what kind of kicks that they use. Try to emulate those. Listen to how the bass drum and the kick drum are arranged and how they sound together. See if you can match that. Listen of the volume of the guitar compared to the synths and how they sit with the vocals. Everything that you hear in a reference track can be used and put into your own song. This will help develop your ears and give you a better sense of what a good sounding song actually sounds like. One common mistake with reference tracks, though, is not balancing the volume of your track with the reference track. Reference tracks that you get are mixed and mastered, which means those LUFS that I was talking about before are often really loud. And if you listen to that track and it's way louder than your track, you're just going to automatically think it sounds better. Like I said before, your brain gets tricked into thinking loud sounds are better. So make sure that they are the same volume or around the same volume as you're mixing. There are apps that do this automatically for you. My favorite is called Metric AB. I use it quite a bit. And that leads me to my very last tip that I've learned from 500 hours of music production videos. And it's probably not something you want to hear, but videos won't row your boat. You can be on the ocean of YouTube mixing and production tutorials all you want, but no amount of videos is going to get you where you want to go. No amount of videos can really teach your ears what they need to know. How to hear compression, how to get a feel for EQ, how to be able to hear a song in your head and then put it onto the screen. The best way to do all of those things I just mentioned is to actually go and do the damn thing and make music. Yes, it's helpful to learn some tips and tidbits along the way, but there is nothing that can substitute the time behind the speakers, the hours actually put into mixing, to making music. Nothing can replace the trials and the tribulations that you get and from all the mistakes you make as you go along the way. Another thing that keeps me going and that I always tell myself is that quantity begets quality. The more you do something, the better you inevitably get at it. Okay, so that's a lot of tips, a lot of info that you can use to go out and make better music. Now, if this video helped you out at all, go hit the like button and the subscribe button for more music production advice just like this. And if you're serious about improving, go download my 30-day production action plan. It'll walk you through what you should do every day so that you can have 3 songs at the end of 30 days, all using the methods I've talked about in this video, and it's free. If you want to go more in depth on any of these topics, you can check out my YouTube channel. I've got a slew of videos that detail each point even more. And here's a really good one that I made on the power of subtle distortion that you can watch right up here.